Welcome back, everybody. We are ready to begin our afternoon session. And so often with these meetings, as I said, this is the third one, we always get questions and people always want to know, well, what does USDA think about this? What does OLAW think about this? How does ALAC view social housing issues? And so to quell your fears and to answer your questions, we have our panel of speakers this afternoon who are going to address some of these issues from the different perspectives. And I don't have the order. Who's first? Okay, yes. So we have Carol Clarke is here from APHIS, USDA APHIS, and she's going to give us a USDA perspective. And then Pat Brown is here from OLAW, and she will talk about some of OLAW's views on this. And then John Bradfield from ALAC International, who will talk about ALAC's view. So I welcome our panelists, and you will have some chance afterwards this afternoon in the breakout sessions to have more discussion with them. So we'll let them talk and take it from there. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for attending this session. And what I'm going to do is talk about the Animal Welfare Act and the requirements for social housing and grouping of laboratory animals. So my outline, I'll talk about the Animal Welfare Act. Then I'll talk about some common themes that you see in our regulations. You will find compatibility statements, space requirement statements, innovative housing statements, and then, of course, we'll talk about IACUC and veterinary responsibilities. And then I'll focus on the dogs and dog exercise program and social housing of non-human primates within the context of the program to promote psychological well-being. And at the end, I'll end with some discussion about some findings during USDA inspections. So just to understand the relationship of the Act to the regulations to our policy manual. So the Animal Welfare Act is a public law. It's a statute enacted by Congress in 1966, and this law governs the care of use of animals in research for both government and non-government facilities. And then you have the animal welfare regulations. As you know, all regulations are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, what you call the CFR. Every regulation that's listed in the CFR must have an enabling statute. In this particular case, we're talking about the Animal Welfare Act. And the purpose of the regulation is to describe in greater detail how an agency should interpret the law. And then we have the Animal Care Policy Manual, the policies. And these are guidelines for regulatory interpretation. They're not regulations. These are guidelines that animal care gives to the stakeholders to help stakeholders interpret the regulations. So the Animal Welfare Act talks about standards of care, and it specifically mentions the dog exercise program and also promoting psychological well-being in non-human primates. Acceptable standards, well, of course, our Blue Book, you know, what we call the Blue Book, which has the animal welfare regulations. We also accept the guide. We also accept the Ag Guide. We accept peer-reviewed journals and other publications like textbooks. So when you look at our regulations, Part 3, standards, there's standards for every regulated species. Of course, when you get to subpart F, it says all other regulated species. This is where your farm animals, your ferrets would fall in, some of your cotton rats, you know, things like that would fall there. So let's talk about the first statement, compatibility. If you look across all the standards, you see general statements. Basically, animals must be compatible if they're housed in the same enclosure. And there's no housing with another species unless it's compatible. But there are some exceptions. Hamsters are housed with hamsters. Guinea pigs are housed with guinea pigs. And rabbits can only be housed with another species for scientific purposes. And of course, separate housing for vicious or overly aggressive animals. Pretty common sense. And then you'll find minimum space requirement statements. And the whole key here is the animal must have the ability to make normal, postural, and social adjustments with freedom of movement. And the minimum space requirements are outlined for each species except for subpart F, because that's very general. And of course, these minimum space requirements also talk about dams and offsprings. And speaking of dams and offsprings, Females in estrus or menses are not housed with males unless for breeding, pretty common sense. Dams with offspring may be housed with others of the same species, especially in the cases of breeding, except for nursing hamsters are not housed with other hamsters. You don't leave the male in there, you're going to get cannibalism. And of course, any animal suspected with any kind of contagious disease must be isolated from healthy animals. And then there you'll find statements about innovative primary enclosures. And what are those? Those are enclosures that do not precisely meet the floor area and height requirements described in Part 3 standards per species. So what does it do? It provides sufficient volume for the animal to express species-typical behavior. And many times, all the time, IACUC approval is required. And last, there's always a statement about what the attending vet is supposed to do. Every research facility must have an attending veterinarian with the appropriate authority. And when we start talking about dogs and non-human primates, the duties of the attending vet is very spelled out. So let's talk about dogs. Well, here's that compatibility statement. Group housed dogs must be compatible, not housed with any other species unless compatible. And an animal may be removed from grouping if he's vicious or aggressive, or as per an IACUC-approved protocol, or when the attending vet feels that the health and well-being of this animal may be affected or contagious disease exists. So here's the space discussion. As you know, as far as space is concerned, as far as the height of the caging, it has to be 6 inches taller than the tallest dog when standing, normal standing on all 4 legs. The floor space, the square footage, remember the length of the dog from the tip to the base of the tail plus 6 inches squared over 12 squared, which is 144. And how many dogs can be there? Up to 12 non-conditioned adult dogs, that's greater than 3 months old. And each dog has to have 100% of the required space. And when you start talking about breeding colonies, again, similar statements. Okay to have females in heat with a male. Okay to have the dam with the offspring with another adult. Dams with nursing pup, each pup gets greater or equal to 5% of the dam space, but you have to take some things into consideration: breed, behavior, and accepted husbandry practices. And as we talk further about housing requirements, tethering. Permanent tethering is not permitted. So what do we mean by tethering? It's basically a dog on a leash, and the leash is attached to some stationary object. So that's not acceptable housing. And if a facility wants temporary tethering as primary housing, they have to write to APHIS, write to us for approval. To my knowledge, we have not approved any of that. And then there's innovative housing. Again, the key word, volume for species-typical behavior despite not meeting the floor area and height requirements. And that requires IACUC approval. And now we talk about the dog exercise plan, which is specific to dogs. So facilities must develop, document, and follow a plan to provide exercise. This plan must include written standard procedure, and this plan must be made available to the USDA inspector and funding officials. To fulfill the requirements, let's talk about group housed dogs. Dogs that are greater than 12 weeks old have to have 100% of the floor space for each individual dog. Now, if you have individually housed dogs, again, over 12 weeks old, and they're in a cage or a pen, the run has to be, cage pen or run, has to be twice the required space. If there's not enough space, then you have to provide an opportunity for this dog to exercise in a run or an open area or some similar activity. I've seen, techs take dogs out for long walks. There are places roped off where the dog can just run around, something like that. And dams with litters are excluded as far as that floor space requirement. But if your dog is individually housed, for some reason, totally away from any other dog, then there must be some type of positive physical daily contact with humans if there's no sensory contact with other dogs. Some things that are not permitted, forced exercise methods such as swimming, treadmills, and carousel-type devices. And what's the role of the attending vet? to approve the dog exercise program, and the attending vet can authorize an animal not to be placed in compatible housing if the health or well-being of the animal is in jeopardy. The attending vet can exempt an animal from the exercise program if he or she feels that the health and well-being is at risk. But that exemption must be documented, and it must be reviewed every 30 days, unless it's a permanent condition, and even then, there needs to be documentation of that. And of course, the IACUC. The IACUC can approve an exemption to the exercise program if it's scientifically justified by the PI and is in an approved protocol. And of course, that exemption must be documented by the committee and reviewed at least annually. And records of that must be available to the USDA inspector. And also remember, the IACUC approves innovative primary enclosures. So let's talk about non-human primates. Well, many of you are familiar with the chart, which about minimum space requirements. The animals are broken down from group 1 to 6. It's all based on weight. And when we go into space requirements, well, we were talking about group housing, very similar to the dogs, some of the minimum floor area requirements per animal. So each animal has to have 100% of the space requirement. And of course, the minimum height of the largest animal. So that means that the animal's perched, that's sort of like the normal posture that they're working from. Dams with offspring, if the offspring is less than 6 months old, then the space is that of the dam. And of course, there's a statement about innovative housing, sufficient volume to allow typical species behavior, and IACUC approval is required. And there may be exemptions to these space requirements. It might be due to the research or for veterinary purposes. And of course, IACUC approval is required. And I should say, for the innovative and for the exemptions, of course, the attending vet is in the loop on that. When you start getting into that group 6, those guys are the brachiators and your great apes. So it's a little bit more than what's written there. Brachiators are going to need more space due to natural movement, so more space than what's on the chart. Great apes that are greater than 110 pounds or 50 kilograms are going to get more space, and that's kind of subjective. So when we talk about the promotion of psychological well-being, the Animal Welfare Act wants an environment adequate to promote psychological well-being. So when we move to the regulations, it gives you a little more detail that environmental enhancement to promote psychological well-being, research facilities must develop, document, and follow an appropriate plan, and the plan must be in accordance with currently accepted professional standards as cited in appropriate professional journals and reference guides. So these are the required elements of the plan, and I want people to think, because sometimes people don't think about the entire plan. The entire plan is social grouping, environment enrichment, special considerations, restraint devices, and exemptions. Too many times people are either focusing on the social grouping or environmental enrichment. You have to look at the whole plan, and you have to treat it as a whole plan approach. But we're going to talk about social grouping since that's what this conference is about. So again, a compatibility statement. Compatibility is determined by professional standards or observation and/or the attending veterinarian. Not housed with another species of non-human primate unless compatible. Don't see that much in research, but zoos have done some things where they've mixed species. The animal must be able to see and hear others of the same or compatible species, unless the attending veterinarian believes that the health, safety, or well-being of the animal is at risk. And of course, an animal can be removed from compatible grouping if the animal is aggressive, has contagious disease, or the attending vet feels that this is necessary. This is our regulation. The environmental enhancement plan must include special provisions to address the social needs of non-human primates that are known to exist in social groups in nature. So this is our position. In most cases, based on currently accepted professional standards and, the Blue Book, our Blue Book, the guide, or even journals, group housing is the most appropriate method of ensuring that the animal's social needs are met. Lack of appropriate caging does not constitute an acceptable justification for an exemption. And here's a word about standards. and you know all of this, professional standards evolve and change over time. Hence, it's recommended to stay informed and keep up with the current literature. In fact, our first two speakers really highlight that. And if you look at where we've come, 20 years ago, throwing a toy in a cage was appropriate, and now we've evolved to the level of very sophisticated programs with behaviorists and charts and all that. So yes, things change, technology changes, thinking changes, so we have to move with the times. And as far as your individually housed non-human primates must be able to see and hear non-human primates of their own or other compatible species unless the attending vet feels otherwise. Some of these animals can be a special consideration, requiring special attention to address situations where they're unable to see or hear another non-human primate. Not all non-human primates want to be around other non-human primates, but that's something that the attending vet would work on, and working with behaviorists. The attending veterinarian, as you know, directs the environmental enhancement plan, determines compatibility, can authorize no placement in social housing if health or well-being is jeopardized, and of course can exempt an animal from participating in some or all of the plan. But this exemption must be documented and reviewed every 30 days unless that's a permanent condition. And of course, the IACUC can approve innovative primary enclosures, can approve an exemption to all or some of the program that requires scientific justification from the principal investigator. The exemption must be documented and reviewed at least annually, and the documentation must be available to the USDA inspector and funding federal agencies, very similar to the dogs. So let me just talk about a few things we've seen on our inspections. One is record keeping, and citations can occur if the record keeping is inadequate or for some reason it's not available to the inspector. And that usually happens when somebody who has the keys to an office or the access code is off and the USDA inspector shows up and they can't get in. So as far as that's concerned, always make sure that there's somebody else that has access to these records. But generally what we do see is there's no indication that the attending vet reviewed the exemptions every 30 days. There's no record of it. So it's just something to keep in mind for your program. Fighting. Okay, yes, animals do fight. Decisions on citations are made on a case-by-case basis. There are a lot of factors taken into consideration: the degree of the injury to the animals involved, the circumstances. Was it human error? Somebody forgot to lock a cage or pull a panel? Or was it just animal behavior, two owl monkeys living together in peace, and then they wake up one day and, don't like one another? And how is this program to promote psychological well-being constructed? Is it, let's take a look at that. So again, this is on a case-by-case basis. And if you do get cited and you're not happy with it, we do have an appeals process. First, we try to, between the inspector and the facility, see if we can kind of resolve things. If that doesn't happen, the facility has 21 days after receiving the inspection report to file an appeal. After 21 days, the appeal will not be accepted. Once the appeal is filed, the appeal is reviewed by a team, which includes a subject matter expert and the regional director of that particular region, and then the associate regional director from the other region. So it's a team, and all decisions are final. So just to summarize, as far as considerations for socially housing animals, here's the questions you're supposed to ask. Are the animals compatible? Is the enclosure large enough? Can species-typical behavior be expressed? How should individually housed animals be handled? And as far as the dog and the non-human primate programs, exemptions can be through the IACUC or the attending veterinarian. If it's the attending veterinarian, these exemptions need to be evaluated every 30 days, and you must keep accurate records. And of course, we're always available for guidance. We also have a stakeholder registry, and you can go to our website, and this registry will allow you to get updates, and you'll get a sense of what's coming down the pike. And I guess we take questions at the end? Okay, thank you.